So the second Antarctica Byrd expedition continues from 1933 going into 1934. This one lasts another 2 years. And we do know that when they were out there on this second expedition, that they also established a second base out there. And on this base, they established the very first known free Masonic lodge in Antarctica, lodge number 777, under Admiral Byrd. You also have members from different free Masonic lodges from multiple different nations pledged to this lodge because Byrd was a well-known Freemason. He was actually a master Mason of the Scottish Rite coming out of the Cane Lodge. And it was pretty much established that everybody in Byrd's expedition and anybody after that point that passed over that 66th parallel, anybody that crossed over into Antarctica would be honorarily adopted into this Masonic order with Byrd as the Grand Master. And they literally called this thing the Order of the Penguin. The entire region of the Antarctic Circle was considered this free Masonic domain of the Emperor Penguin. And obviously when you're dealing with Freemasons, you're dealing with a lot of secrecy. So there is a good chance that they're not talking about the animals that live on the continent. Because again, anybody that crossed that 66th parallel, that crossed over into the Antarctic Circle, would be known under the Masonic order as a royal penguin. And again, as far as we know, it is the very first Masonic lodge ever established in Antarctica. Masonic Lodge number 777, officially documented under the Masonic Tyler Registry. So it seems like these expeditions had a lot of Masonic influence. There was literally an order from the president at the time, Theodore Roosevelt, directly to Admiral Byrd to conduct this expedition, which granted immediate funds, immediate government support to this expedition. And this was essentially an act of Congress that granted over $350,000 to the Department of the Interior to oversee and operate this expedition. And of course, the Department of the Interior deals with national landmarks, land conservation, and more specifically with the identifying and managing of caves. And again, the Department of the Interior is sent in to manage this third expedition into Antarctica with, again, Admiral Byrd at the helm, who once again is a well-known Freemason. And we know about that Masonic marker set up by the Department of the Interior in Haywood County, North Carolina in 1938, just 1 year before this expedition. That basically stands as a landmark to honor the Freemasons. And every single year, the Masons hold their North Carolina Summer Assembly at this landmark set up by the Department of the Interior. And just 1 year after this, in 1946, the United States heads back into Antarctica for their fourth expedition on the continent in less than 5 years, Operation Highjump. And this was a 6-month mission, again, conducted between 1946 and 1947. Once again, led by Admiral Byrd. And he had actually retired in 1945 and was recommissioned as a rear admiral specifically for this expedition. And you had the U.S. Secretary of Defense at the time, James Forrestal, send in Task Force 68 to back up this expedition. We're talking about some of the most skilled soldiers in the military, elite class from both the Army and the Navy. And we're not talking about a small fleet. Over 4,700 military personnel sent on this expedition compared to the 125 sent on the last mission. And it was actually the largest expedition of any kind ever organized at the time. The most heavily armed military operation at this point in history. And again, this mission was officially called Operation Highjump, but you had a lot of people in the press referring to this thing as Operation Mystery, because again, they're training for war over a year after the war is already over. So the question was, why are we sending an entire armada, an entire army, 4,700 soldiers out to do combat training after the war is already over? And of all places, in Antarctica. But this expedition takes place, again, 4,700 soldiers led by the flagship of this mission, the USS Mount Olympus. This was the flagship chosen for this mission. Now remember, in Greek mythology, Olympus is the home of the gods. This is where all of the gods were supposed to live and supposed to rule from. And again, they named the flagship of this expedition the USS Mount Olympus. Now, one of the things that was released to the public was that during this expedition, Admiral Byrd supposedly dropped a United Nations flag directly over the South Pole, essentially marking the South Pole region as United Nations territory. Now, just before this happens, Admiral Byrd makes a press statement, and it's interesting what he says. He says, "I'd like to see the land beyond the pole. It is the most inaccessible area on the face of the earth. I would like for somebody on this expedition to get beyond the pole into unknown territory. They might find anything there. There might be a lot of volcanic mountains. There might be some of the highest mountains or the highest plateaus in the world. That area beyond the pole from Little America is the center of the unknown. You might see something there you had never seen before." So again, you got to ask, why did they drop that United Nations flag over the South Pole? It seems to be that this is what this expedition was really about finding and accessing this land beyond the South Pole. And remember, you got the U.S. Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, who brings in Task Force 68 for this expedition. And what's crazy is James Forrestal was the very first U.S. Secretary of Defense. And he was appointed into this position right before Highjump. And actually, the entire U.S. Department of Defense was created a month before Highjump. So Task Force 68 is deployed through the Department of Defense. And remember, this is the first time that we had ever been made aware of Task Force 68. So at this point, we really didn't know what Task Force 68 was. We just know that they were specifically deployed for this specific expedition. But when we look at Task Force 68 right now, we can see that we're not just talking about elite military, but also elite paratroopers. And not just from the US, from Germany, France, the United Kingdom, from militaries all over the world. This is literally an airborne force of expert paratroopers. And when you have troops making these free falls and conducting these airborne operations, these free falls are referred to as a military high jump. Any high altitude military parachuting is referred to as a high jump. More specifically, halo jumps, high altitude, low opening, where they're jumping between 15 to 35,000 feet from the ground. So again, a high jump, a high altitude parachute jump. And this expedition is called Operation Highjump. But if you look at this as them making a high jump or a military free fall, then it makes a little more sense. And we know that less than 2 months before Highjump, we had military from both the Army and the Navy conducting paratrooper training in the Arctic, just on the other side of the North Pole. So we've got high altitude military free fall training being conducted in below freezing temperatures in the Arctic. And then less than 2 months later, Operation Highjump is commenced in Antarctica. And at the very least, we know that every single member of Task Force 68 was parachute ready, because based off of the Army Observer's Report for Highjump, each individual person was equipped with 12 parachutes, hundreds of feet of rope. They were definitely prepared for something. And just think about this. Again, this mission is called High Jump. And another place that we see this, the high jump or the pole jump, where they're essentially using the pole to get to a destination that cannot be reached any other way. The only way you can get to this destination is from the pole. using the pole to get to an otherwise inaccessible region. And you can literally look at it as like a high jump from the pole. Again, like dropping down into something from a high altitude. And what's crazy is that if you look at the term high jump and how it was used around this time, going back to the early 1900s, it was used to describe a form of punishment. Someone facing some type of punishment, facing some type of judgment, or literally someone being imprisoned. At times, it was used specifically as a synonym for the term prison. Just think about that subterranean prison within the Buddhist ideology and Tartarus in Greek mythology, that subterranean prison for the gods. So again, what did they find out there? Exactly what were they dealing with? Because just a few months after this expedition, Admiral Byrd comes out suggesting that it would be a good idea to set off atomic bombs at the polar regions, because he was saying that the poles would be the best part of the world to test these weapons out, and that by bombing the poles, that would potentially uncover natural resources that could be buried thousands of feet under the ice. And the best way to get to these resources was to set off these atomic bombs at the poles. And he's suggesting that we set these nuclear bombs off at the pole just a few months after Highjump. So again, you gotta ask, what did they find out there? Because whatever they found had them immediately contemplating setting off nuclear bombs at both the North and the South Pole. They never did set these bombs off, but they were definitely putting out there that, we may have to bomb the North and the South Poles. And the question is, why? We also know that when high jump is over, just when they leave Antarctica and they make that last stop in Chile, Admiral Byrd talks to the Chilean press. He was saying he wasn't trying to scare anyone, but that if a new war was to happen, that the United States would be attacked by planes flying over one or both poles. And based off of these expeditions, he felt like, the poles no longer offered, this guaranteed security, and that basically we needed to immediately come up with strategic ways to protect the poles. So basically saying we need a permanent military presence in Antarctica, and that we need to take immediate measures to basically secure these areas, to lock down these areas, not just the South Pole, but also the North Pole, both polar regions. He's not trying to scare anybody, but if we don't get security measures in place immediately, we risk being left vulnerable to being attacked by planes coming from these regions. So if we don't want that to happen, we need to let the government come in and secure these regions, secure the poles. So basically giving a reason to lock down these polar regions. Now, we don't know exactly what they found out there, but whatever they found was obviously significant. And all we can really do is look at the timeline, because it's interesting. Operation Highjump ends in February of 1947. Then 5 months later, in July of 1947, we get the supposed Roswell UFO crash. And then we start seeing this large uptick in UFO sightings all over the country. Same exact year, just 5 months apart. And also in this same year, in 1947, they end up placing a model of John Cleves Sims' hollow earth concept in the Museum for the Academy of Natural Sciences. And to this day, it is still in this museum, along with a lot of his research papers and different documentation connected to Sims and this concept. But again, it is placed in this museum the exact same year as Highjump. So Highjump ends, they leave Antarctica, and in less than a year, they head back in again. And this was considered the official follow-up to Highjump, called Operation Windmill. And they called it Operation Windmill because the expedition was completely dependent on the continuous use of helicopters, aka windmills, because this was literally the only mode of transportation that they brought onto the continent. 33 helicopters. This was the very first mass helicopter mission ever conducted in history. where the entire mission was conducted exclusively with nothing but helicopters. Again, 33 helicopters. And the task force is brought back in for this follow-up mission. You actually had 500 task force members for this follow-up mission. And every single task force member that was involved in this mission was originally involved with Highjump. And it wasn't just task force. You had a handful of scientists from the Smithsonian. One of the other objectives was to reanalyze the wreckage left over from the 1909 United Kingdom expedition into Antarctica, what was called the Nimrod expedition. And this had been one of the earliest expeditions out to Antarctica, the Nimrod expedition conducted by the United Kingdom. So in this follow-up to Highjump, one of the goals was to locate and analyze the remnants of the SS Nimrod. And the name choice is interesting because we know Nimrod is a character from the Bible. He was supposed to be this highly dominant king that established and ruled over the two most powerful empires in the world. And he becomes so powerful and so influential that he actually ends up inciting a worldwide rebellion against God. The name Nimrod in Hebrew actually means to rebel. Because again, according to the story, he was supposed to have used his influence to encourage this mass rebellion against God. And there's actually not that many references to Nimrod in the Bible. But one of the few is in Genesis chapter 10, verse 8. And the verse actually says, "And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth." So the verse is saying that Nimrod was mighty in the earth, not on it, not around it, but in it. And it could seem like a whole lot of nothing, in could still mean on. But what makes this more interesting is, we're all familiar with the story of Job, where Satan comes before the sons of God and speaks to the Lord directly. And the Lord asks Satan where he's come from, and Satan tells him. And what's interesting about this is when the Lord asks Satan where he came from, what his response is, because he says, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And remember, in the 14th century, about 1472, we get Dante's Inferno, where the main character, Dante, is moving through the 9 circles of hell. And within these 9 concentric circles of hell, you have all the false gods imprisoned down there, chained down in hell. Every single false god, including Nimrod. And they're actually chained deep down in the earth in the 9th ring of hell, chained to the walls of Cocytus, this frozen ice cavern. They're supposed to be imprisoned there specifically for waging war against heaven and sending the earth into chaos in the distant past. And Nimrod and all these false gods are actually imprisoned down there along with Satan, who is specifically imprisoned in ice in the center of hell. Now remember, when they thermally mapped that 660 kilometer discontinuity, the mantle transition zone, and they started reading those below freezing temperatures in that region. And then you have diamonds that have resurfaced from that region that are covered in ice. Ice 7, that structure of ice that can only be formed at high levels of density found in the mantle. And because there's so many of these diamonds coming from this region that are saturated in this ice, it's theorized that the cold slabs that are sitting at the top and the bottom of the mantle transition zone are potentially filled with this ice. And again, when this area is thermally mapped, these slabs show signs of consistent magnetism, a high level of magnetic resonance that could be potentially keeping them locked in place to the top and the bottom of the mantle transition zone, like walls surrounding it and blocking it from all the geothermal activity around it. Almost like a description of that frozen ice cavern, Cocytus, where, according to Dante's Inferno, all of these false gods, Satan and Nimrod, would be. And again, Operation Windmill reportedly found traces of the Nimrod expedition, the campsite that they set up in 1909, and some of the supplies that were left behind. And again, this was one of the stated goals of this mission, to try and find remnants of the Nimrod expedition. And what we do know is that according to that statement from Admiral Byrd, the goal of Highjump was to find and explore that quote unquote land beyond the pole. So again, was Operation Windmill following up on what they had already found? We know that right after Operation Windmill, the exploration of Antarctica starts to pick up even more, and we get 6 different countries that build permanent bases on this continent. Great Britain, France, Norway, Australia, Chile, and Argentina all set up permanent bases in Antarctica in the exact same year, 1949. And then 5 years later, in 1954, Admiral Byrd goes on to national television to announce that the U.S. was going out to Antarctica for the 6th time. And it seemed like he was subtly saying a lot and revealing a lot during his interview.
Our guest tonight found out whether there was any land north of the North American continent. He made that first discovery flight, and I must say that Admiral Byrd, our guest tonight, is not only our greatest living explorer, but he's been an inspiration to countless Americans. Admiral Byrd, you've been to both the North Pole and the South Pole. Is there any unexplored land left on this earth that might appeal to adventurous young Americans?
Yes, there is. And not up around the North Pole, because it's getting crowded up there now, because they find out it's really usable, not only to live in, but militarily. But strangely enough, there's left in the world today an area as big as the United States that's never been seen by a human being. And that's beyond the pole, on the other side of the South Pole, from Middle America. And I think it's quite astonishing that there should be an area as big as that unexplored.
That's a tremendous
So
challenge.
there's a lot of adventure left down at the bottom of the world.
Admiral, do you hope to see that?
I do.
Well, Admiral Byrd, I can understand, I think everybody can, the interest in the North Pole because it's so near our greatest challenger, Soviet Russia. But why this interest in the bottom of the world? Nobody living down there, is there?
No, it's pretty cold. There's only one permanent resident, that's the emperor penguin. The little ones live further north. I tell you one reason they're interested. It's by far the most valuable, important place left in the world for science. That's why the scientific groups all over the nation are really interested.
Admiral Byrd, is there a competition among other nations to try to get information about Antarctica and possibly to secure some of these resources?
Well, yes. There are now 7 nations very much interested. Russia is interested tremendously. That I'm sure of. Australia has an expedition down there. The Argentine, the Chile, New Zealand, Britain, and so on. And so we don't do much about claiming anything.
Admiral, you make this sound a little crowded. Are there that many expeditions now there or en route there?
Well, you know, as I said, it's the most peaceful place in the world, but I don't think it will be for long because of this intense interest on the part of other nations and this nation.
An expedition to which I believe you're the advisor is now en route. What is that expedition doing?
Well, that's the icebreaker Atka, and it's a reconnaissance expedition. It's going down to the South Pole area to make certain observations and to look for some bases. They will be back in April, and they will report back, and upon the information we get from that undertaking, we will base the bigger expedition that's to follow.
Is that very definitely planned, or is that...
That is being planned right now. So I'm willing to say to you that there will be a number of expeditions that will follow, I think, year after year, at the bottom of the world, because the government has really become interested.
So he asked him, is there any unexplored land left on this earth? And he says, there is an area as big as the United States that has never been seen by a human being, and that this area is beyond the South Pole. He says on the other side of the South Pole from Little America, which, is the base that they built just a couple of miles away from the South Pole. And he basically says it's amazing that there would be an area as big as that unexplored. And now, because the audio is a little hard to hear sometimes, it is debated. Is he saying that this area is across from Little America or Middle America? If he's saying Middle America, then we can see that if you start from Middle America and you chart a path halfway across past the South Pole, it's going to put you on the other side of the planet. It's going to put you in Australia, in a country that already exists and it's already been explored. So it's not really going to fit the description of an area that has ever been seen by a human being, a large area of land that has never been explored. And not only that, but this is supposed to be an area as big as the United States. And we know Australia is fairly close to the same size as the United States. It's got about 11% less landmass. And you can just see the size difference if you take the landmass of Australia and lay it over the top of the United States. You can see that the United States is just a little bit bigger, but not by much. So it would be an area nearly the size of the United States, but it would be halfway across the world. And again, it wouldn't be unexplored and unseen by any human being. So it's safe to assume that more than likely this unexplored landmass is not Australia. But again, this is an unexplored landmass as big as the United States that has never been seen by a human being, and that is located beyond the South Pole. And this became this hot button topic at the time, this mystery of this land beyond the South Pole, this massive region beyond the South Pole that apparently could only be reached from the South Pole. And it got to the point that they were actually referring to this region as the area south of the South Pole. Now we know once you reach the South Pole, you're at the most southern region of the Earth. If you're standing at the South Pole, there is no way to go any further south. And actually, any direction away from the South Pole is going to be north. If you're standing right at the South Pole, any direction that you're going away from that point is going to be a northern direction. There is literally no other direction to go from that point. So the only way you could go south of the South Pole is to go down, literally taking a direction down under the South Pole. Now, if we move up a couple of years, seismologists are studying the mantle, and they notice that when seismic waves get to the middle of the mantle, when they hit that transition zone, they had actually seemed to hit these anomalies within the transition zone, these anomalies right in the middle of the mantle. And when they hit these things, the waves slow down drastically. The S waves, which again only move through solid objects, travel so slowly through these things that you can literally trace out some type of structure or formation, some type of separate structures in the mantle. And so they end up calling these things large, low shear velocity provinces. And that, from what they can make out, these provinces sitting in the middle of the mantle are sitting on two opposite sides of the planet, one below the Pacific and one below Africa. So pretty much right at the Pacific Rim. And each one of these structures is supposed to be about 2,000 miles long. So each one of these is supposed to be about the size of a continent. They say comparable to the size of Australia. And this is when they start to refer to this thing as a potential mountain range, because not only are these things stretching thousands of miles across, but they're also reaching up through the mantle hundreds of thousands of miles. You got one reaching 500 miles high and the other getting up to 1,100 miles high. So hundreds of times higher than Mount Everest. So if these things sat on the Earth's surface, they would reach out into the thermosphere, which is where the International Space Station orbits. So you can just get an idea of just how big these things are. Now, again, obviously, where you have mountainous regions, you're also going to have a surface. And you had a group of seismologists come out and announce that they found evidence that there could potentially be an ancient ocean floor sitting at the bottom of the mantle and wrapping itself around the core, completely surrounding the core. So basically that the entire core may be wrapped in this oceanic crust. And because it's sitting right at the bottom of the mantle, it is actually creating the boundary between the core and the mantle. And the reason that they think that this is oceanic crust in this area is because when seismic waves hit this area, the movement of the waves matches the way the waves move through the ocean floor higher up. It's giving you that same density. And the way that they came across this was from high resolution imaging of thousands of seismic readings under the ice in Antarctica. It actually had 15 different monitoring stations buried under the ice in Antarctica. And again, they took thousands of seismic readings from these stations, and everywhere they probed, they saw this anomaly sitting at the bottom of the mantle, wrapped around the core. And again, all of the wave patterns matched what you would get from oceanic crust. And so this oceanic crust, this ancient ocean floor, is basically creating those smooth plains underneath these more mountainous regions, these continent-sized anomalies within the transition zone. And remember what they call the transition zone, the second continent. The second continent underneath the continental crust on the Earth's surface, because it's got all the same topography, all the same features that you can find on the continental crust on the Earth's surface. All those same variables are present in this transition zone. And again, they think this is potentially created from ancient primordial crust that has traveled down and formed over millions of years because of millions of years of tectonic movement. And all of this tectonic movement has created these massive anomalies that resemble continents. So much so that they refer to those anomalies, those provinces, they refer to them together as the third continent, a fallen primordial continent sitting within the second continent, the mantle transition zone. And again, they theorize that underneath them is oceanic crust, but they actually have no idea what these structures actually are. They know they're there, they can see them, but scientifically they are considered enigmatic, completely mysterious, completely unknown. They really do not know what these structures are, or their origin, where they came from, and how they ended up in the position that they're in, sitting in the middle of the mantle. So there's no real, true, conclusive explanation for these things. But they have a working hypothesis called the giant impact origin, which is basically the idea that these structures in the mantle are possibly remnants of an ancient planet, an ancient planet called Theia that was orbiting in our solar system about 4.5 billion years ago. And that this thing was about roughly the size of Mars. And within all the chaos within our solar system, at that time, 4.5 billion years ago, this planet, Theia, ended up crashing into the Earth. And from that impact, half of the planet broke off and wedged itself to the Earth, while the other half went into an orbit around the Earth and became the moon. So you have this giant impact that sends this ancient planet, Theia, crashing into the ancient Earth. And then in the aftermath of that impact, you got half of this planet that is now attached to the Earth as the Earth is still beginning to form. And then again, the other half creates an orbit around the Earth and eventually becomes the moon. And so the thought is what we see now as these provinces in the mantle are actually the remnants of this impact, the remnants of this ancient planet, literally pieces of this ancient planet, Theia. Now, we know that Theia comes from Greek mythology, and that within Greek mythology, Theia is actually one of the Titans. And when the Titans are defeated, Theia is one of the Titans that is sent down and locked away in Tartarus, that subterranean prison for the gods. And that name Theia literally translates to God or goddesses. And they're saying that remnants of Theia are sitting deep down under the earth, deep down in the middle of the mantle in that 660-kilometer discontinuity in the mantle transition zone. And remember, Theia is supposed to have been this ancient planet separate from Earth, a completely separate planet from Earth. So essentially an extraterrestrial body in space that impacted and attached itself to the ancient Earth. So essentially what they're saying is that there is something extraterrestrial sitting deep inside the Earth, deep down inside the Earth. Something extraterrestrial 660 kilometers down in the mantle transition zone that was trapped down in the Earth in the very distant past. And again, that what is down there is the size of a continent, about the size of Australia, so nearly the size of the United States. And again, 60 years ago, they were saying that there's an unexplored area south of the South Pole that has never been seen by a human being that is as big as the United States. So essentially an area the size of a continent south of the South Pole. And obviously, if you take the United States and you place it over the top of Antarctica, the majority of the United States is going to almost completely cover Antarctica. You got maybe a third of the continent not covered by the United States. So an area as big as the United States is going to take up more than half of the continent. And we know that by this point, we had so many expeditions that had gone in and thoroughly explored this continent. So after all these expeditions, all this exploration, to have an area the size of the United States that is unexplored and has never been seen by a human being just doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. The only way it would make sense is going to have to be on a different landmass separate from the continent of Antarctica, a landmass the size of the United States that no explorer, no one that has ever circumnavigated the planet, no one that has ever flown a plane, sailed a boat or ship, that has ever traversed through the Southern Ocean has ever seen or come across, or this area as big as the United States that has never been explored and never been seen by a human being could potentially be deeper down below the pole, south of the South Pole. Now, just a couple of months after Highjump, Admiral Byrd drops a press release titled "Our Navy Explores Antarctica." And this is supposed to be a written account through Admiral Byrd of the Navy's exploration of Antarctica during Highjump. And in the article, he actually talks about them finding and exploring this quote unquote land beyond the pole. There's a section titled "Into Mystery Land Beyond the Pole." And again, this is a report coming directly from Admiral Byrd. And in this section, he says, it had been one of the major objectives of the Navy to penetrate beyond the pole into this area of inaccessibility, the vastest unknown which remains in the world. When one speaks of beyond the South Pole, the language is not entirely figurative. The pole is, of course, by definition, the farthest south possible to reach, but it hardly is a midway point towards what now must be the goal of Antarctic exploration, the interior of those millions of square miles which no eye has seen. And it goes on to them actually entering this area of inaccessibility and giving a record of what they found in this region. And again, this is Admiral Byrd recording this. He says, "As I write this, we are circling the South Pole. The temperature is 40 below zero. Our altitude is 12,000 feet. The pole is approximately 2,500 feet below us. On the other side of the pole, we are looking into that vast unknown area we have struggled so hard to reach. We are dropping on the pole the flags of the United Nations. The young men with me join in sending to you and to the Secretary of the Navy our gratitude for giving us this opportunity for geographical discovery and great adventure. As this message is finished, we are heading into the unknown beyond the pole. Altogether, we had surveyed nearly 10,000 square miles of the country beyond the pole. As was to be expected, although it is somewhat disappointing to report, there was no observable feature of any significance beyond the pole. There was only the rolling white desert from horizon to horizon. So basically, they searched 10,000 square miles of this land beyond the South Pole and found nothing. This area was totally barren, totally empty, basically a desert. So in other words, there's nothing worth mentioning. There is nothing to be concerned about. There is nothing to see here. As expected, it's just a vast, empty space. Nothing worth looking further into, and nothing worth giving any further reports on. But at the same time, we're still getting multiple expeditions to this region, all these permanent bases being built in this region, all this interest from just about every country, and this large amount of interest from the U.S. government. And remember, right after Highjump, we've also got Byrd suggesting that they should bomb the poles, suggesting that they set off an atomic bomb at both the North and the South Poles, right after they explore this area south of the South Pole, and apparently find nothing of significance out there. And ultimately, they never set those bombs off. But he does come out again and say that we need to set up security measures to lock these areas down, to restrict access to the poles. It's too dangerous to leave these areas unguarded. We'll be vulnerable to enemy attacks. And to prevent that, we need to restrict access to the North and South Poles. Right after Highjump, right after they explore this area of inaccessibility. And again, not too long after this, we get the U.S. going back into Antarctica for the 6th time for what they ended up calling Operation Deep Freeze. And this actually wasn't just the U.S. It was led by the U.S., but it was actually a joint expedition between 76 different countries as a part of the International Polar Year, which was supposed to be this international scientific project where all these countries came together to carry out scientific studies on the North and the South Poles. And again, you got 76 countries that are a part of this, that offer resources and support to make this happen. And you actually get over 40 different countries that send scientists down on this expedition. And between these 40 countries, you've got over 1,600 scientists that are a part of this thing. And again, the United States is leading the expedition with 9 other countries also at the forefront, basically offering the most immediate support and looking to set up permanent bases. You got New Zealand, France, Japan, Argentina, Norway, Australia, Chile, Russia, Great Britain, all at the forefront of this expedition, with the United States at the head position. Now you gotta think, this is less than 10 years after World War II, where you had all these countries fighting each other, waging full-blown war on each other. And remember, all of that tension after World War II was supposed to have created the Cold War, where all this tension and all this friction is still supposed to be so high between these different countries. But right in the middle of all of that tension, they're all coming together on a joint expedition to explore Antarctica. Again, with the U.S. leading the expedition and Admiral Byrd placed as the officer in charge. You had Admiral Byrd, who again was supposed to be retired, named the officer in charge of this entire expedition. And again, you got 1,600 scientists from 40 different countries, 200 task force members, and all of this is led by the flagship, the icebreaker Atka. This was the lead ship for this expedition, the USS Atka. Now this is interesting because this name, Atka, is of an old Greek origin. It's actually a variant of the word agartha. And the word agartha is one of the alternate forms of the word agartha, which we know in mythology is supposed to be an advanced city or an advanced ancient civilization located deep within the earth. And we've got the lead ship for this expedition, the flagship, named the USS Atka. So Atka leads Operation Deep Freeze into Antarctica. Again, the goal was to make more scientific advancements, specifically at the South Pole, and to set things up for future research. And between that time, you had over 45 bases built by 11 different countries, and you get 3 built by the United States. And out of those 3 bases, they set up a permanent base directly at the South Pole. And it is the only permanent base that has ever been established at the South Pole. Again, you got 76 countries involved in this thing, and they all agree that the one and only permanent base established at the South Pole would be established by the United States. And almost 70 years later, it is still the only permanent base located at the South Pole. But again, you get over 45 permanent bases that are built on the continent during this expedition. And they actually set up a nuclear power plant on the continent to power all the bases that are built during this expedition. They installed a nuclear reactor at McMurdo Station, one of the US bases, and this powers the bases for about 10 years straight. It's like a portable power plant that they could use to keep feeding power to these bases and ensure that they could permanently stay out there. Now, outside of setting up these bases and conducting scientific research that was supposed to be beneficial to all these different nations, we have no clue what else they were doing out there. We know they had a whole documentary tracking the expedition produced by Disney that, again, just like the one for Highjump, was very by the numbers and, didn't give us much of anything. We know there were a lot of people involved, a lot of nations involved. And just like all the prior expeditions out there was a lot of free Masonic influence all throughout this thing. Every single person involved in this thing was pledged into the Royal Order of Deep Freeze, another Freemasonic order established by Admiral Byrd. The esoteric and exalted Royal Order of Deep Freeze, under the arcana rites of the Southern Cross, which arcana basically just means mysteries or hidden knowledge. It's literally another word to describe secrets. So literally the secret rites of the Southern Cross. So the hidden knowledge of the Southern Hemisphere, Antarctica, under the Freemasonic Royal Order of Deep Freeze. And remember, Byrd had already established the first known Freemasonic lodge in Antarctica in 1935, the second time they went out there. And even then, that was considered an international lodge, open to every Freemason involved in Antarctic exploration from every country. So they're already letting you know that there are things going on out here that we are not letting you know about. Remember, the Department of the Interior is heavily involved in this, and we know about their Freemasonic ties. And again, for the Royal Order of Deep Freeze, Byrd is at the forefront, essentially the Grand Master of this Masonic order connected to Antarctica that's built around the idea of secrecy and hidden knowledge, arcana rites. So you got everybody involved being initiated into this Royal Order of Deep Freeze, but everything ultimately points back to Byrd. And think about the name of this thing, Operation Deep Freeze. And remember, Byrd was describing Antarctica as like a great refrigerator. And he actually said he envisioned it as a vast deep freeze unit. That the ice cap was like a deep freezer, and that anything that was stored within it would remain preserved. Anything, food, supplies, even human remains, this could be preserved by the ice sheet. That the ice sheet was like a natural deep freezer. And so we get Operation Deep Freeze. And think about it, the deeper you go down into a deep freezer, the more preserved things get. Now you gotta think, if Antarctica is working like a deep freezer, Just how far does that go? We know the ice sheet gets up to 3 miles thick, 15,000 feet. But remember, we've got this area of inaccessibility south of the South Pole. And they had already surveyed it, they had already explored it, and there's supposed to be nothing out there. It's supposed to just be an empty wasteland. Even though we know that during deep freeze, they did explore it. And despite the fact that they had already surveyed this area 8 years earlier and saw nothing of significance out there, just an empty, featureless desert, they still went back out there again and conducted air surveys. And again, even though they had already explored this area, they were still referring to it as unmapped, unexplored, and an area of inaccessibility. They were literally referring to it as the unmapped heartland of Antarctica. And we know a heartland is the central point of a landmass. And the central point of Antarctica is the South Pole. So they're saying this area of inaccessibility beyond the South Pole is located at the South Pole, an inaccessible, unmapped, unexplored land south of the South Pole that again was completely desolate, completely empty, completely insignificant, but that they continued to survey even during Operation Deep Freeze. And in less than a year, they follow up Deep Freeze with Deep Freeze 2. And in less than a year after that, Deep Freeze 3. Less than a year after that, Deep Freeze 4, and so on. And since 1955, all military activity in Antarctica has been labeled Deep Freeze. Every military mission, every expedition that is conducted out there since 1955 is codenamed Operation Deep Freeze. In that same year, 1955, as Deep Freeze is being conducted, we also have the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition being conducted by the British, which was basically a private expedition sponsored by the Commonwealth of Nations, which was made up of 56 members of the United Nations under the patronage of Queen Elizabeth. And one of the goals was to trek and survey the entire continent of Antarctica and all the surrounding landmass. And as they mapped out these surrounding areas, they started naming them. And it's interesting because we get Commonwealth Range, King George Island, Rothschild Island, Deception Island, Nimrod Glacier, Mount Erebus. This is interesting because in Greek mythology, Erebus is the primordial god of darkness. He's actually the god of the darkest region of the underworld. He is basically Tartarus. The name Erebus is completely interchangeable with Tartarus. And as the Commonwealth expedition is going on, we know that they also reported going out to this area beyond the South Pole. And they were still calling that area unknown and unseen. And they were saying that this area is 2/3 the size of Europe, which again, when you line that up with Antarctica, it just doesn't make any sense for this to be an area that is unknown and unseen at this point. It's just taking up way too much of the continent that should have already been explored. But just like the US, in order to access it, they said they were going south of the South Pole. And as the Commonwealth expedition is going on, the Royal Society of London, which is like a union of the world's most prominent scientists based out of the United Kingdom, they establish a base out there and they name it Halley Research Base after the astronomer Edmund Halley. Now remember, all the way back in the 1600s, Edmund Halley was the first person on an academic level to suggest that the Earth was hollow. And remember, the Royal Society of London gave him a naval warship and made him the temporary captain of that ship and sent him on an expedition to the Southern Ocean to go investigate his theory that the Earth was hollow and open at the poles. Because remember, he believed that the Aurora Borealis was potentially the gases from within the Earth coming up from the poles. And they weren't ever able to determine this because, remember, they made it all the way to the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, but did not make it to the poles because they couldn't get through the terrain, all that ice within the Southern Ocean at that time in 1698. And almost 260 years later, the Royal Society is building a base in his name in Antarctica. Now, mind you, he had a lot of other accomplishments. He was an astronomer royal because of his scientific accomplishments. But it's interesting that they would build a base dedicated to this well-known astronomer who believed the Earth was hollow and potentially open at the poles. That they would specifically build this base in his honor near the South Pole in Antarctica. And it's built by the Royal Society, the same organization that sent him on that original expedition to see if he was actually right, if those openings really were there. And the question is, when they eventually got there 260 years later, did they see that he was right? Because in 2004, the Royal Astronomical Society actually takes measurements, magnetotelluric measurements, underneath East Antarctica and directly underneath the South Pole, and they release the results. Now, magnetotelluric measurements are basically taken by using the electromagnetic field to measure the depth of rock layers below a surface, in this case below the South Pole. And it's basically done by observing how those electromagnetic waves move through the rocks within a particular region. So they're basically measuring the rock layers below the South Pole. And when they released these results is when it got interesting, because you can see here what they ended up saying was our magnetotelluric results have provided some of the first definitive indications of sub-ice structure and physical state below the South Pole region, a substantial and widespread sedimentary section with significant porosity or matured organic content is inferred just below the ice sheet, corroborating earlier conjecture from refraction seismic data. So they're saying that there's a definitive indication of a substantial and widespread sedimentary section below the South Pole region with significant porosity. Now, in geological terms, porosity is referring to the percentage of open spaces or voids within a volume of rock. So basically, porosity is the amount of open space within rock. And again, they're saying that based off of their results, there is definitive indications of a substantial and widespread sedimentary section below the South Pole region with significant porosity. So a substantial and widespread sedimentary section below the South Pole region with significant open space or voids. And they're saying that they're already seeing this from earlier seismic data that had already been collected from this region. That when seismic waves hit this region, they were refracting as if they were hitting some sort of open space. Then it goes on to say, deep resistivity structure of the South Pole region at present appears to differ from that typical of cratonic lithosphere worldwide, in exhibiting low resistivity in the lower crust and the upper mantle. So they're saying that the South Pole region is exhibiting low resistivity in the lower crust and the upper mantle. Now, again, from a geological standpoint, when you're talking about resistivity, you're talking about rock's ability to not erode, to not wear away, basically not to dissolve. And the porosity of rock basically determines that rock's resistivity. As the porosity increases, the resistivity of that rock also decreases. So in essence, the resistivity of rock decreases as fracturing and weathering increase, as porosity increases. And again, they're saying that their results show that below the South Pole, there is low resistivity in the lower crust and the upper mantle. So basically, there are signs of weathering and fracturing in the rock within the lower crust and the upper mantle below the South Pole region. And that low resistivity is because of that substantial and widespread sedimentary section below the South Pole region that is exhibiting a significant amount of porosity, a significant amount of open space or voids. So basically what it sounds like they're describing here is a deep cavernous region below the South Pole that extends down all the way past the lower crust and the upper mantle, which obviously would mean that it would extend down all the way to the mantle transition zone. And that what they see going on here below the South Pole within the cratonic lithosphere, which is basically that crust and mantle rock, differs from what can be observed from lithosphere readings in other parts of Antarctica and in other parts of the world. That this high porosity and this low resistivity in the crust and in the mantle are unique to the South Pole. And they believe it could be thermal activity underneath the South Pole that's causing the rock to melt, sending it into a liquid instead of a form, and basically making it indetectable. This is all theory. They really do not know why the porosity is so high and the resistivity is so low below the South Pole, but this is what they're seeing. And again, this is coming from the Royal Astronomical Society. And that was in 2004. Now, in 2022, the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory announces this research initiative titled Imaging the 3D Viscosity Structure of the Antarctic Mantle with Existing Observations from GPS and Relative Sea Level, where they plan to map the viscosity of the mantle under Antarctica. Now, viscosity is the resistance to gradual deformation of a medium under shear stress. So in geological terms, a rock's ability to resist deformation, basically a rock's ability to not weather and to not fracture. And within this research, you can see that it says there exists extensive geological and geophysical evidence for significant lateral variations in viscosity and for the existence of low viscosity regions in the Earth's mantle below Antarctica that deform rapidly on decadal or faster timescales. Now again, viscosity is a rock's ability to resist gradual deformation. And right here, they're saying that there is geological and geophysical evidence of low viscosity regions in the Earth's mantle below Antarctica that deform rapidly on decadal or faster timescales. So over the span of decades, these regions have been consistently eroding. And specifically, there's evidence for significant lateral variations in viscosity. Now, when you have low viscosity from a lateral angle, we're basically talking about lateral erosion, where that viscosity decreases and that rock starts to open up laterally, because lateral erosion is going to cause rock to widen. And it's basically going to cause gaps within rock to widen. And it's pretty much the same idea with vertical erosion, just in the opposite direction. And of course, when you put these things together, lateral erosion and vertical erosion, this is how you get large openings within the earth. Those cavities or cave-like regions deeper down in the earth. And again, right here, they're saying that there is geological and geophysical evidence for significant lateral variations in viscosity and for the existence of low viscosity regions in the Earth's mantle below Antarctica. So it's as if they are describing lateral erosion that has created a deep cavernous region, a large opening below Antarctica, leading to even more open space beyond the lower crust and beyond the upper mantle down into the transition zone, down into that 660-kilometer discontinuity. And if that space is dropping down into the transition zone, it could potentially drop down to those continent-sized anomalies, those large, low shear velocity provinces sitting in the transition zone. And the reason they call that area the transition zone is because when waves move past the upper mantle into that region, they suddenly speed up and refract in different directions, like they are transitioning into something different, something with a high amount of velocity, like they may be moving into some form of open space. It's almost like what is being described is a massive cave or a massive cavern 250 miles down into the earth, sitting in the middle of the mantle in the transition zone that is somehow connecting to Antarctica. And the crazy thing is, remember, we have nearly the exact same thing going on at the North Pole. Remember, we got that other mountain ridge at the center of the Arctic Ocean, at the center of the North Pole, the Lomonosov Ridge. And right at the center of that ridge, right at the center of the North Pole, we've got that deep depression, the intrabasin. And even though this thing is only visually dropping down about a mile down into the earth, they actually estimate that the sediment deformation within this thing reaches down to 41,000 meters. So about 25 miles down into the earth. They're detecting deformation within this thing. And 25 miles down into the earth is going to take you directly to the mantle, which again is ultimately going to lead you to that transition zone. So again, at the North Pole and at the South Pole, we have nearly the same exact phenomena being detected. Signs of sediment deformation at the geographic pole going all the way down to the mantle. And again, we know when you send a spherical object similar to the Earth into a constant spinning motion, into a constant rotation, and you add an element to the interior of it, that spinning or that centrifugal force creates a cavity or a cylindrical mass at the center of that object that extends to the top and the bottom, or to the north and the south, to the north and the south poles, just like polar openings. And it makes sense if this is what they found when they got to the North Pole and they got to the South Pole during those early expeditions. Why, even after they signed that agreement to never shoot another nuclear missile into space, they still continued to set those nukes off at ground level, underground, for another 29 years straight, almost 3 decades, non-stop. All these different countries all around the world continued to detonate these nuclear bombs underground for 29 years straight. And you got to think, they were setting these things off before they even signed that space ban treaty. They started setting these things off in 1951. And the last underground nuclear test wasn't until 1992. 41 years they were setting these nukes off underground for 4 decades, nonstop. Every single country that had nuclear capability was setting these things off underground. You had thousands of different nuclear tests, and more than 75% were detonated underground. You had over 1,352 underground nuclear detonations. And that's just the ones we know about. So you got these explosions going off underground all over the planet for decades. And from that intense impact within the earth, you're going to get intense movement within the earth, intense waves, long period seismic waves. All that impact from those nuclear blasts creates seismic waves within the earth. And depending on how strong that explosion is, you can actually produce S and P waves from these underground nuclear explosions. Usually in the aftershock after that initial blast, you get S and P waves that come behind it. And of course, the larger the explosion, the more of these waves that get produced. And once these waves are produced, they're able to be recorded and measured and used to map out the interior of the Earth and basically produce like a scan of the Earth's interior, a crude outline of the interior of the Earth from those waves. And normally seismic waves are going to be produced from earthquakes. Again, when an earthquake happens, it releases energy that sends waves throughout the entire body of the Earth, depending on the magnitude, how strong that earthquake is. And the average earthquake is going to release 1,000,000 times more energy than one nuclear explosion. Because again, the energy from that earthquake is moving throughout the entire body of the Earth. But those large scale earthquakes are rare. So you have to wait years for that natural phenomena to occur. And then it's completely unpredictable as to when it's going to happen. So you have no control over when it's going to happen, where it's going to happen, or how large it's going to be. The amount of energy that's going to be produced from that earthquake. You're relying on nature to take its course and produce those waves. But again, a large enough underground nuclear explosion will produce seismic waves within the Earth. And even though one earthquake releases 1,000,000 times more energy than one nuclear explosion, multiple underground nuclear detonations all around the Earth can release higher levels of energy and create higher amplitude waves and basically simulate a higher magnitude earthquake and create stronger seismic activity that can be measured and mapped and used to create an outline of the interior of the Earth. And of course, all of this can be controlled and manipulated through the yield of underground nuclear detonations, which could explain why countries all over the world continue to detonate these nukes underground for 41 years straight, non-stop. That they were trying to produce enough energy that would create waves throughout the entire Earth that could be used to measure and map the entire interior of the Earth. We know they literally had temporary seismic stations set up in different areas to track and to monitor the waves from these underground explosions. So they're definitely recording these waves and using them for something. And again, it makes sense. If they found large depressions leading down into the deeper interior of the Earth at the North Pole and at the South Pole, why they would want to produce these waves all throughout the interior of the Earth and analyze them from those seismic stations. It's almost like they were trying to seismically outline and map the interior of the Earth and see what was going on in there. And if they did potentially find something cave or cavern-like penetrating deep into the Earth, they could have been using that seismic data to look for any other signs of any other cavernous regions similar to what they may have already come across. And if they found anything else, most likely to quickly identify where it was and to quickly lock it down. Because again, 41 years straight of underground nuclear explosions all over the world, creating constant tectonic movement, constant high yields of energy within the Earth, constant seismic waves. We will never see this level of seismic activity ever again. It was like a massive ground penetrating radar campaign, potentially the most extensive and detailed mapping of the interior of the Earth that has ever taken place. But everything seems to be pointing to some type of deeper access into the Earth at the poles. The science, the seismic data that we can see is all leading there to the poles. And this could explain the logo of the United Nations and why they chose to use this specific projection of the Earth. Because, of course, we know this is an azimuthal, equidistant projection of the Earth, a flattened out view of the Earth from the perspective of the poles, a perspective of the Earth with the pole as the central point. So again, you take the spherical Earth, that three-dimensional object, and you rotate it around to focus in on the poles and make the poles the central point, in this case, Antarctica. And then from the pole, from that central point, you begin to spread that sphere out until you have the three-dimensional Earth flattened out and fully visible in a two-dimensional form. Again, with the pole as the central point. Remember, they also call this a polar projection because the pole is the number one focus on this map. And obviously in this configuration, you have the North Pole represented as the central point, with the South Pole spread out and distorted around it. But you have both poles as the main focus of this projection of the Earth. And you can do the same thing in the opposite direction. Take that two-dimensional distortion and bring it back into a sphere and move that point of focus around, all the way around, and place it on the North Pole. And from the North Pole, again, spread that sphere out until, again, you have the 3D Earth represented in a 2D form with the central focus on the poles. In this case, with Antarctica as the central point and the North Pole stretched out and distorted around it. In either case, the poles are always the center of focus. Everything is centered on the poles with this projection. And again, whether you center in on the North or the South Pole, you're taking a three-dimensional Earth, a three-dimensional object, which you're not going to be able to see all aspects of all at once, and you're spreading it out and rendering it into a two-dimensional form so that you can see all aspects of that three-dimensional object all at once in a 2D form. It is a spread out two-dimensional projection of the Earth with the poles as the central point. Remember, azimuthal meaning starting at the pole, and equidistant meaning equal distances apart. So you got the poles at equal distances apart as the central focus of this projection of the Earth. Everything is focused in on the poles. It is a full view of the Earth spread out from the perspective of the poles. Again, a polar projection. Everything is being projected from the poles. And remember what they're telling us. Earth is an oblate spheroid, rounded out at the equator and flattened out at the poles. That because of the Earth's rotation, because of that constant spinning, over time, it's become more flattened out at the poles. And again, the azimuthal equidistant projection is focused in on the poles. The poles are the central point. So the region where the Earth is more flattened out as an oblate spheroid is the central focus of this projection. So technically, this would be a flat Earth map because it's centrally focused on the flattened out region of the oblate Earth. And remember, oblate can also mean depressed or pushed in at the poles. Again, this could explain why they chose to use this specific projection for the United Nations, because this projection makes the poles the central point of focus. It centers in on the polar regions with all the countries collected around the poles. It's almost like they're letting you know the poles are the central point of focus. This isn't even the original logo. If you go back and you look at the original logo that was used in 1945 when the United Nations first formed, they literally had this central point where the pole is outlined right at the center. It's like all the lines of latitude are zeroed in on that point, on that outline of the pole. Again, it's almost like they're telling you the poles are the point of interest. The poles are the focus. What is bringing these nations together, what is uniting these nations is the poles. Whatever is at the polar regions is the central focus for these nations. Because if you look at this original logo, it's like they're literally targeting the poles. It's like they literally have a target on the poles. Again, it's like all the latitude and longitude lines are zeroed in on the poles, zeroed in on that central target, almost like a target grid with the point of convergence being at the poles, like a bullseye aimed at the poles. I mean, literally, if you place this thing next to a target grid, there's almost no difference. And you got the lines of latitude and longitude looking like crosshair lines that is converging in on the main target. Again, with that main target or that bullseye being the poles. Again, it's almost like they're saying the poles are the target of these nations. All the nations are uniting around this central point, around the poles. Remember, the UN logo is formed in 1945, 1 year before Operation Highjump. Remember, during Highjump, when they surveyed that area south of the South Pole, they dropped the United Nations flag at the South Pole. And years later, in 1989, planted the United Nations flag at the North Pole. Again, it's almost like they're telling us the poles are the focus. Poles are the central point of interest for these nations.